Welcome to The Real Market with Chris Rising, the only podcast that brings the real estate conference panel to your headphones. You'll hear from superstars from every realm of commercial real estate, the biggest brokers, the most well-known architects, the largest investors, and the most visionary developers. We'll learn what they do, how they do it, and what drives their success. We'll discuss the latest trends across regional markets, capital flows, both national and global, and we'll explore technology's role in shaping all of it. We'll take a clear-eyed look at where we've been, where we are now, and what's to come. Real conversations, real experts, real insights. This is The Real Market. All right, welcome to The Real Market with Chris Rising. I'm excited to have Bret Swango with me today. Bret is a Colliers person, and we love having Colliers on. His job, really exciting for what we've been talking about over the last, 5 or 6 episodes. He is the head of location intelligence and workforce analytics. Now, what I like about that title is it just sounds like you're in the middle of data and technology, and you must be unbelievably connected to the world. So, Bret, I'm really excited that you're on The Real Market. I'm excited about our conversation. So welcome.
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity, Chris.
Well, why don't you just give us a little bit about what your job is? You seem like you have come to real estate as a career, that you have this technology background, and you seem very representative of where I think globally real estate is going. But tell us about your exact job.
Yeah. So quick on background. So grew up in a really small town in central Illinois, like a mile outside of a town of 225 people, that small. And, as a kid, I could barely read, but frankly, numbers always kind of made sense to me. So as I was thinking about where my career path was going, I went to school in Bloomington Normal, which is the home of State Farm. So they're the largest home and auto insurer in the United States. And then ultimately went to work at Allstate, who's the largest publicly traded home and auto insurer in the United States. So if you think of like, what is the insurance industry, right? It's kind of, some have called it the original big data industry, because really your product is just a promise at a price, right? So you're effectively hoping that you're better at math and or pricing that risk than your competitors. Was fortunate enough to spend 4 years at Allstate working both in, I'll call it more of a traditional finance role, which was really about working with the business units to say, hey, what are the assumptions behind these capital projects that you're trying to get, capital allocated towards. And then the other half of my time there was what we called operational analytics. Basically, how do we use the analytical horsepower of the organizations, the data scientists, the actuaries, to solve other business problems besides pricing? And that went all the way from how we staff our call centers, how we comp our agents, or most similar to what I'm doing today. We've got 10,000 agents around the country. If we were going to put one more agent anywhere to maximize their odds of being successful, where would we put that agent? And, more importantly, what are the data points we'd want to look at from a supply or competition perspective, as well as a demand or the consumer perspective, in order to inform that decision? And ultimately, I guess almost 10 years ago, I got the opportunity via another gentleman who I played football with at Illinois Wesleyan. I found out about an opening at Colliers with a very sophisticated we called it capital markets based tenant rep. It was effectively a group that focused exclusively on representing users inside of single tenant or anchor tenant assets. And we were effectively asset class agnostic. So office, industrial, life science. And the whole premise is what's the thing that attracted me to the space was the value creation, right? And what's that asset worth today, vacant, versus tomorrow with a lease from a Fortune 500 company, right? So there's all this value creation that takes place there, but the users or the companies who were that tenant, they didn't, their core business is not real estate. So they weren't aware or, as aware as I thought they probably should be to say, hey, what is that, what has been that value creation from that signature? And then our job was to basically use math to help them maximize their value capture. And then about probably 7 years ago, we were pursuing the largest life science company in the world at the time. And we went to them and said, hey, there's this thing that's happening in the capital structure of your asset. We think we can save you some money to renegotiate a lease. And they were like, hey, this is all great, but we just put $300 million into this facility. What we don't know is if the talent is here to get us from where we are to where we're trying to go as an organization. And I'm like, all right, well, if the largest life science company in the world who's in the business of using data to make decisions doesn't have this information, maybe others don't. And that was what really kind of started my path down the workforce side. And then over the last couple of years, it's like, hey, I'm not a labor market expert. I am kind of a data nerd, I guess you could call it. And so it's like, how do we just get what we believe to be best in class data points around the most important variables to inform how companies think about why they should locate where?
Man, and you came out of Illinois Wesleyan, and what was your major?
Finance. Yeah.
I figured it was finance.
Yeah.
How did all of the data analytics creep into your career path? Was that doing the insurance business where you saw
that was really at Allstate, just coming from that environment, right? Where again, if you look at the leadership team, basically everybody either had a pricing or a marketing background. And what I saw increasingly over time in my experience there, leadership was becoming more pricing or more analytical and less marketing, or like I'll call it like the softer side. And I would argue even today, marketing is much more analytical than it was even 5-10 years ago. So that really, I'll call it like honed my analytical rigor, because if you weren't asking the right questions and or getting the right data to stress test the assumptions, it's the quote on my LinkedIn, the most dangerous thing in business is finding the right answer to the wrong question, right? A little Peter Drucker. That was really, really informative. And then I think, and that's just also kind of, I wasn't much, I'm probably on some spectrum somewhere. So I wasn't very good like readers, but math always came pretty easy to me. So it was kind of a pretty good synergy.
So the language you're speaking, if somebody is over 50, I think it must go over a lot of people's heads because you didn't say one thing about knowing your market. You didn't say one thing about walking properties. You didn't say one thing about making sure you knew the 10 other brokers in a small market so that you can, because every market becomes a micro market, no matter whether it's Manhattan or a small town. Nothing you said had anything to do with what a broker who got trained pre-computer era, which I would say is around the mid 2000s is when the computer really started to take effect in real estate. So when you describe yourself as a real estate person, and given where you are at age-wise and in your career, do you sometimes come in and their eyes glaze over because it's not what they think real estate is?
Yeah, it's kind of it's a constant battle, honestly. I would say my narrative resonates most with the C-suite, or like specifically like CFOs, COOs. Maybe head of supply chain. Even the heads of HR now, that's becoming a much more analytical segment of the business. I do sometimes struggle with real estate directors, right? Who again, I think kind of come from, hey, our job is, kind of the traditional real estate blocking and tackling. One thing I will say is that that local market intel and that brokerage expertise is super critical to what I do. I think of it as like a Venn diagram, right? It's like what I'm trying to translate is, how is the world changing? Like, what are these big macro forces, whether it's deglobalization, AI, the green transition, the demographic cliff that we're kind of approaching here? How do you translate those changes into the relative value of a square foot of land or office space or manufacturing space in Tampa versus Austin versus San Diego? Yep. But it's the macro change plus the micro location level data, plus the real estate expertise. Because I say when I spend almost all of my time, I'm doing more work now advising investors and developers than I historically have, because really all they want to know is, hey, where is a tenant going to want to be tomorrow? Right. Yeah. So, and how do we use data to help inform that opinion? But historically, most of my time was spent on the occupier side.
So let's start with one kind of structural question, or maybe foundational question. When I started in the business, and a lot of other people started in the business, you like locked your file cabinet because you couldn't trust people. The thing that made you valuable is you had information that others didn't, and you didn't share it. When fax machines came, you grabbed that fax before anybody else. So foundationally, for your job to even exist, there had to have been a major change in the brokerage business, which on my podcast, a lot of us, I had the VTS guys when they were actually filming space. That's what VTS stands for, view the space.
Yeah.
And the battles they fought early on, getting brokerage firms to unlock the data, and really individual brokers being willing to do that. I believe that's all changed. Can you talk a little bit about how Colliers, as a company, collects the data that allows you to perform analytics? So let's start at just the basic level. You work at Colliers. I know, but I'll assume for this that those brokers have to share the information. If they know that there's a lease coming up and they know a senior partner, that goes into some database. Is the firm at a point where they can actually access all that information?
So a key caveat, which I started to on my last point, is only in the last, call it 2 years and really 18 months, have I started to work almost at all with real estate data. So what I call is and this is try to follow my nomenclature here because it's not perfect, but I call it, we focus on demand side analytics almost entirely. So that's, where talent pool shifting, what has happened from a migration perspective, where's government funding being allocated, which ports are busiest, where you see in the greatest level of freight activity kind of shifting. And then you pair that, right? So that's the demand side with, I'll call it the real estate market information, which is, again, where I rely on those local partners at the market or sub-market level to say, one of my favorite sayings is the Warren Buffett, price is what you pay, value is what you get. I'm only really looking at half of the equation. The other half of that equation is, what is it going to cost me? Okay, yeah, you love the demand narrative on this market and maybe even this sub-market, but what is the price that you have to pay for that relative to competing markets around the country who have similar, I'll call it, structural elements, right? And that's the other big piece of my world is when I'm thinking about a location, I'm not, you tell me, hey, what's the value? I'm sitting in Chicago today. What's the value of this, this 10-acre parcel in the South Loop that, is zoned for cold storage? I'm not thinking of that. Okay, what are the comps in, the, Chicagoland area, or maybe even the southern suburbs or whatever. I'm saying, what are the structural characteristics of that location relative to other, basically census tracts, zip codes, counties around the country? And then how does that compare in terms of what I call that demand side analytical story? And then I work with my local teams to get the supply side of what is, and again, I obviously, absorption, right? Everybody would say, oh, absorption is a demand metric. Well, I put it, that's in the real estate category. So I kind of put that on, hey, that's the whole supply side of the story. And obviously very good information matters a lot in that space at times. And I know it really matters to the local level, but a lot of I think one thing that has enabled my role to have, a bigger place in the market than maybe it did 5 or 10 years ago is that the decision-making process from a real estate perspective has become less local and more, national in nature. Now, that isn't to say that to get the best deal, you still need the best local person, right? It's just that I'll call it the alternatives in play. There's a wider landscape of geographic alternatives for most of the groups that we're talking to today versus 5 or certainly 10 years ago. So that was a big caveat. And then to answer your question, there's Colliers, like a lot of our competitors, I'm sure, are working through kind of, I'll call it a data strategy to be able to say, hey, how do we capture all this information? One of the things, again, I see in the real estate world relative to my former life, which was much more data dependent, is some groups, I feel like, you got to always ask, is the juice worth the squeeze? So what are the incremental steps that you're taking to collect that data? And then how valuable is that data? Because that incremental step is costing you time. As we all know in this business, time is money. So what's the incremental value? And then how do I make sure that I'm effectively communicating that incremental value and showing that incremental value to the broker or to the CSC or whoever I'm expecting to go through that process? And one of the pieces that we're finding is that, hey, the better we can do of using our tools, technology, resources to remove friction from a broker's ability to do a deal. And then the better the job that we can do of effectively catching the relevant data in that friction removal process. Now you're basically incenting the brokers, right, to be using the mechanism that we're ultimately going to be leveraging to capture that information to hopefully help build a better mousetrap for our clients. So I know I was a little bit discreet in some of that because I don't know what all exactly I can disclose. And I also will profess that I'm not the expert inside of Colliers in regards to our data strategy. I am, on I'll call it the advisory board for part of that, but that's our kind of our approach today.
Well, let's break that. I mean, it's a good segue into what you do on a day-to-day basis. So I know that we had a little pre-discussion. You said you used to do a ton of office, and that's evolved. How has the general economy, the role that you have at Colliers, and the business that Colliers is seeking changed and evolved, let's just say, since the beginning of COVID? Or maybe a little bit before COVID, but yeah.
Sure. Good question. So, again, really what I'm doing is I'm just trying to use data to identify market inefficiencies. And obviously part of that is, hey, where's the biggest? And then applying those inefficiencies to saying, okay, well, how big is the market opportunity? And that market opportunity is heavily dependent on how the macro, or I'll call it like the asset class level supply and demand metrics are moving. So again, I'm part of occupier services. So our core mission is to basically say, hey, how do we use data to help occupiers make more informed location selection decisions? Right. Well, when, I think the office market was much more active, call it in 2018, 2019 than it is today. And then during COVID, right, what boom was this big? And so it started with, there's really a macro and a micro. Right. When I'm an office user, I'm trying to decide, hey, I need to hire, 100 data scientists. What should that be in Boston, Austin, Chicago, San Francisco? Like and I call that macro. And then the micro would be, okay, I've decided I want to be in Chicago. Should I be in downtown? Should I be in Fulton Market? Should I be in, whatever, River North? Like which of those specific like micro market locations should I be locating within? Part of what it, shifted kind of Colliers is a heavy, we're, I think on a percentage basis of the big four, we're the most reliant or the most heavy focused on industrial. So that's kind of in our DNA inherently. And really using this data, we're always kind of, I call it solving for scarcity. Right. So historically, tenants were the scarce element in the value equation in commercial real estate. So, hey, how do we use information to get tenants to say, hey, we want Colliers advising us because we have the greatest level of trust in their information, their expertise to be able to get us the best real estate market outcome. During COVID, I would argue that, especially in industrial big box, vacant buildings were selling for more than buildings with a 10-year lease from an investment grade user, right? And you couldn't get, some of the big guys wouldn't even do long-term leases because they're like, frankly, rents are going up too fast. So as soon as by the time I get the leasing, we're already under market, right? So then what became the scarce element? The scarce element became land. And they're like, hey, we're sold out of, basically spots to build these big boxes, in the Inland Empire, for instance. Now, the next question is like, do we go to whatever, Hesperia, Fontana, name your kind of outline. There's these 5 or 6 outlying submarkets that we think kind of have to be next. Which one of them should we be placing our bet within? And that really comes down to what are the variables that matter the most that users have the least amount of information on, right? So whether, again, that's freight activity, whether it's, I'll call it the micro market political environment, whether it's, the labor market dynamics, again, not just labor supply, but ultimately where's the competition for that labor? What's the quality of that labor? The macro regulatory environment, I think, is more important today than it's ever been, right? So understanding, which industries and where is what legislation is in the hopper, right? And how is that going to impact, obviously we've seen this boom in Mexico. Well, if you look at a lot of those companies are, Chinese entities that have effectively gone to Mexico to avoid some of this, this tariff narrative. And there's also perspective narrative that some of that could shift further to where, basically they look through the geographic location into who is the parent entity. And okay, so what is that going to do to the demand south of the border if that ultimately goes through? Right. So, you've heard this term VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. Like that's much bigger piece of the narrative today. And we're just trying to say, what are the things that capital allocators care about? What are the things that CEOs care about? And how do we translate that to place And then ultimately, how do we apply that analysis to the latest, greatest space in the market? Today that's probably data centers to some degree. That's definitely in the manufacturing arena. I laugh that, show me the brokers in the United States who have a background in manufacturing. Right. And then I'm like, okay, well, then what the heck have they been doing the last 40 years when we've been sending all this stuff overseas? Right. So it's this combination of where's there the biggest market opportunity versus where's there I'll call it least amount of expertise, and or some combination of where are there a lot of really important questions that people don't have good answers to, because that's risk, right? Risk is what are the things that matter that I don't have good data on. And our job is to not just help you get the best price, but also help you minimize your risk in that decision process. And we believe that the way we do that is that combination of expertise and superior, not just data, but superior analytics around that data and context to inform that decision process.
So there's a lot we could unpack there, but one of the things that jumps out to me is that you are speaking a language that is much more corporate, much more finance, and much different than the broker who's hoping that through their country club, I get to see the CEO has a warehouse who may want to have another warehouse. It's a much different language, but at the end of the day, you're solving the needs of tenants that need to occupy space. So when you look at a pitch, give us a sense of how does Colliers use you to go win business? It sounds like it's a combination of the local guy who has a relationship. Could be local big like New York, or local small like a town in Illinois. But they're a piece of the puzzle. You're a piece of the puzzle. How does a pitch happen on, let's say somebody's got let's make it big, 250,000 square foot modern distribution warehouse. So there's going to be some robotics and something to it. And they'd like to be somewhere in the Midwest. And the relationship's coming out of Chicago. Tell me how you guys pitch business that way.
So the three-legged stool, and I'm not saying this is the Bible, but I haven't been able to improve upon it, is that it's like RRA, right? Resume, relationship, and angle, right? And what I see in a lot of pitches is there's almost always a relationship. That's why you're in the room, right? And then you're bringing in if you the junior broker, or maybe the team who's chasing it, if distribution isn't your sweet spot, or you haven't done stuff in that particular market, it's like, let me go find the best resume to plug into that. But the piece that I see, I'll call it most lacking, or I want to be careful with my terminology, but I see the biggest opportunity is in the angle. And the angle for us is, hey, what is the thing that you're going to hear from our group that you're not going to hear from anybody else? And that's where we try to really get into this lens on, every company's objective is to maximize their risk-adjusted returns. And there's two sides of that equation. And I think brokers spend a lot of time talking about the top end of the spectrum, which is the returns. So, hey, here's the thing that we're going to do to lower your cost, or here's why I have a little better information than somebody else that I can get, this lease rate down another nickel, relative to the deal that you might otherwise do without me, which is really important. But the other piece of that is, as we all know, real estate's a very small piece of the overall cost spectrum, right? Call it 4 to 7%. The transportation piece is a huge component of that. So how do we get you really good information regarding the relative cost from a transportation perspective of your alternatives? And then also labor is a big piece of that in terms of cost. I mean, roughly, if you assume you've got one warehouse worker per 1,000 square feet of warehouse space, just as like, a rough number, and that can obviously vary wildly. That's effectively equates to, $1 an hour equates to $2 a foot in rent. If you do the math on that, so $1 an hour difference in wages equates to $2 a foot in rent. So it's like, hey, if I can give you, if market rents are, $7 around the country, right? You're talking about whatever that is, 28, 29% differential, right? In location A versus location B. So that gets back to that whole, finding the right answer to the wrong question. How do we evaluate that from a total cost perspective? And I think the market's kind of gotten there to a large degree. So that's how we think about how we're going to help you maximize your returns. But again, every business, it's about risk-adjusted returns. So how do we help you from a risk perspective? And that, from our lens, is how do we get you better data about the most important variables? And it's not just about the data; it's about the context around that data. To say, hey, given how in translating that to how the world is changing, and why we think this is not just the right location for you today, but why it's going to be the right location for you in 3, 5, 7 years, because you're making a very long-term commitment, in one of these leases. So in a pitch, as far as like how I get brought into that, they would say, hey, Bret, this kind of fits the size requirements. We want to pull you into this discussion. I go back to the healthcare space, right? Like, what are the symptoms of the patient? Like, let's talk about what we think the company's trying to solve for. How do we get better information? Because going back to, this is probably a 5 or 10-year-old survey that I don't know if it was Colliers, if it was an industry group that studied, and they basically said, what is the number one ask of our clients? Like, what is the one thing that they wish we did better, or the industry did better than it does today? And that's understanding our business. Right. So if they really want to understand, the client really wants you to understand their business. It's how do we help them better make not just the best real estate decision, but make the best business decision. And that's about understanding, what is changing in the world, what is changing in their company, and how do you translate that to location? And that's where that, so again, going back to the resume, the relationship, and the angle, that is how we believe we kind of construct that angle to say, we're going to come in and say things that are a little bit different. And that hopefully there's going to be, some of your C-suite in the room, because I believe that if we get in front of that C-suite, there's a real opportunity to sell a different story than what most people are selling in the current market environment.
And typically when you pitch business, what is the deliverable you bring? I mean, in the old days, it was probably a printed book or of some sort that somebody would put on their desk and compare against 4 or 5 others. It feels like in the world we live in today, you're delivering much more than a report when you're trying to win the business. So what if I hired you for my company to do the kind of search we talked about, what would be the work product I'd get back in order to make a decision whether to hire you or not?
Yeah. So the 2 big pieces, in addition to your traditional, kind of real estate survey, right, is we're going to provide an assessment of what we believe. And again, depending on what business problem you're trying to solve, we call it macro, meso, micro. Is like, are you trying to solve for, hey, here's the market I need to be in. Hey, here's the general area, or hey, here's the exact location. And depending on the industry, depending on the discrete, business challenge that the company is trying to solve for, we might flex up or down our focus on each of those variables. Because like, just to give you an example, like your supply chain analysis, that's going to usually tell you, that's going to provide what we call a zone of indifference, basically a geographic region for you to search within to say, hey, somewhere in here is where you want to put this warehouse, because that's going to, transportation 60% of your cost. You want to be in this area because that'll kind of help minimize your, this is why you want to be in central Indiana and not Illinois or Ohio or Kentucky, right? Okay, now the question is, within that area, how do we ultimately decide where you should locate? And still the number one concern inside of organizations today, according to the Conference Board, which is like one of the largest, surveyors of executives in the world, still the number one concern of executives is labor. So how do we get you better information than anybody else as it pertains to labor in that location? And then the last piece of the stool, so that's how we help you. Again, my job is to help you get better information and deciding where you're going to locate. And then the second piece of that is helping you figure out how to most efficiently finance that tenancy, right? And by efficiently finance that tenancy, it's understanding what is the relative change in the value of whether it's that land or that existing building with and without your occupancy. And obviously part of that, that spread is your value creation. And then the value capture, that has a lot to do with effectively what are the alternatives in the market, right? Like, yeah, you could juice way up the value of a square foot of real estate. But if they, if the counterparty knows that's your only alternative, your ability to capture value in that equation is very small, right? So how do we help you think about, owning versus leasing, and ultimately how you think about I'll call it the most effective value participation? Because I still believe that's probably the biggest opportunity, among the biggest opportunities in commercial real estate today, is for tenants to be able to do a better job of capturing the value that their tenancy provides versus passing that along to a counterparty, whether that's an investor, developer, et cetera. But being able to better quantify that and capture that value.
Yeah, I'm very impressed with everything you said, and it really does show how the world's evolved. And you go 100 miles an hour, which I love because it's the world I've always grown in and I work in. But let me ask you this: how does Colliers manage its workforce and its relation with people? What kind of software? I mean, are you guys Microsoft based, and everything you're using is somewhere within that ecosystem of Office and Teams, and that's your interaction? Is that the Colliers platform?
So specifically to my group, we're obviously very focused on the business intelligence arena, and then our financial modeling, we still use Excel just because, I know there's some other, whatever, ProLease or ProCalc or all those, but we, frankly, if we're involved in that discussion, it's probably a complex transaction that's going to require a high level of customization. And that is something else I should say. When I first came into the business, I was kind of split between two teams. One of them was effectively really focused on, hey, how do you help build us a financial model that helps us better once we know what companies are trying to solve for, how do we help them optimize? Again, thinking about a simple one is owning versus leasing, given what we're trying to achieve from an income statement of cash flows, balance sheet perspective. How do we help them better quantify the impact of the alternative financing structures? The other half of my job was, how do we get companies better information on where to locate? So that better information on where to locate, we currently operate out of a business intelligence platform that, I think is pretty good. There's the rate of change in the technological evolution is very, very high right now. The issue is that there's like this disconnect between the three-legged stool of what's the business problem I'm trying to solve, what's the best-in-class data available to address that business problem, and then how do I apply technology and analytics to that data to address the business problem. The people who know the business problem the best aren't as in tune with the data and the technology and analytics, and the people who know the data and the technology and analytics don't know the business problem. So I think that your platform matters to some degree, but really that's just how you're visualizing the answer. The more important thing is, what are the data points that go into the equation that you're ultimately using to make the assessment, if you will? How do you determine which of those you should be? Every model is some combination of filtering, weighting, scoring, right? So how do you do that as effectively as possible? And then as more and more data sets become available, how do you start leveraging, I'll call it a more data science intensive approach, which I think a lot of people will say AI, to help inform those decisions. One of my challenges with artificial intelligence is the raw material for AI is large volumes of relatively homogeneous data. And of all the large industries, who probably has the lowest quantity of the least homogeneous data? I would argue that it's commercial real estate. Right. And if you look at CoStar, right? I mean, their market cap is bigger than probably us, JLL, and CB combined. And I think if you ask the average broker to say, hey, well, how would you rate the quality of the information in CoStar? I don't know what the grade would be, but it wouldn't be an A.
It wouldn't be high. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, even just look at like Zillow, right, with their iBuying, and you've got, over 100 million data points in that, meaning homes in the United States. And they obviously, again, look at where their market cap is and or was. And they were effectively trying to automate the home buying process, which I would argue is a much more homogenous product type than office, industrial, or life science. And they effectively can that program, right? So that's where I think the AI, at least on this, and going back to my narrative at the beginning, the AI on the supply side is going to be a little bit slower, or on the real estate side, where I do think there's massive application is on the demand side, or some of these other metrics, again, freight activity, consumer activity, migration trends. That's where we see the big advantage.
I really do believe that the AI influence is going to impact our personal productivity in ways that are really amazing, from AI that can schedule for you to AI that can do eventually we'll get to active AI and away from large language models. I think our personal work worlds and our personal lives are going to be highly impacted by AI. But I think you hit on something really important. Whether AI is relevant to the real estate industry will be how much does Colliers create their own AI around their information. I know C&W feels very protective of their information, as does CB. Well, for AI to really have a global impact, you're going to have to get very specific information shared by all the different brokerage firms if it was going to be immediate, which tells me that may all happen over time. And Colliers is probably there. I'm sure you have a team right now saying, okay, how do we get all of this stuff into an LLM? that we can then micro down to a small language model to work. But I just think because the proprietary information is so important to each of these public companies, you're going to see the personal productivity AI explode. You're going to see the data around 100 years of prices over a plot of land that maybe Colliers has only got it because they were in that market for 100 years. They're not going to share that willingly, and we're relying on a fallible source in CoStar. So I think it'll be slower for real estate to really feel but I think people who are professionals in real estate will have an unbelievable explosion of productivity around how they work and how they interact.
Yeah, it's a really, really good point. And I mean, one other piece that I don't talk about often that I think is really important is what we try to say that we're enabling is quantitatively defensible decisions. And I know that's kind of a mouthful, but the premise being like, hey, if you get into a C-suite or you get into, in front of the board of directors and say, here's our recommendation and here's why, right? Well, the why probably needs to be something more than, hey, we asked ChatGPT where we should locate, gave it our parameters, and it said that we need to go to Nashville. And then we said, okay, well, ChatGPT, can you justify why Nashville? And then they give you some more. Well, what percentage of that information is actually accurate? Number one. Yeah. Number two, then what is all the, again, like this is a quote from one of my business coaches, but he says, in this world, everybody says that content is king, but really context is king. And that's really what you're paying for. And I mean, another great, I think Peter Thiel said that, the internet has commoditized answers. And so it's like, okay, if the internet didn't commoditize answers, I would say artificial intelligence is certainly on its way to commoditizing answers. Yeah. So where's the real value? The real value is in what are the questions that you're asking, right? And that's where I think, and we can all appreciate, right? A real way that you delineate, an expert from an amateur in a lot of different fields is what is the type of questions that they're ultimately asking before they're making, again, going back to the whole, the healthcare narrative, what are the questions that I'm asking the patient to make sure I'm observing all the relevant symptoms before I'm making the diagnosis, not just saying, oh, you've got a cough, it must be COVID. I don't know if that analogy makes sense, but that's a big piece that we've seen is like being able to unpack the logic behind the decision. And that's where I think expertise is going to still remain really relevant for a long time.
Well, how do you see, let's just kind of humanize this for other 30-year-olds out there in the real estate business. For you, I mean, you go really hard. Sounds like you're on airplanes a lot. Your business is kind of a global business. How do you manage your personal use of technology and still have a life?
Yeah, good question. I would say it's certainly a work in progress.
It's age appropriate, so that's good. But it's a work in process.
No, it's a work in progress. I mean, and frankly, I feel very I'm 34, so I feel very fortunate to have, I'll call it come of age just before. I'll call it the cell phone era. Or, I don't think I got maybe a Facebook when I was like a freshman in college or something, right? So it wasn't something I grew up with. Because I think that I don't know that I would have, or maybe any kid is mature. You're so malleable at a young age, right? To have all of that information at your fingertips and how that would potentially impact your development. But in the modern age, I guess what I try to really focus on is there's a book by Daniel Pink called When. W-H-E-N.
Good book.
Yeah, and it focuses on like, hey, are you an early bird or a night owl? And one thing that I do believe, and this is something I sensed even when I came, I'm coming to you from 71 South Wacker in Chicago, which is a new, I think Colliers moved in Class A building, one of the last buildings built before the GFC. And we moved in here in 2019, I think. And we came from a Class B building. And just the ability to move into this building and have access to a great, a gym that's effectively like it feels like you're at a spa. And so the ability to I used to I'd try to get in by like 6, and then I'd work out in the mornings, and then you kind of grind all day, but you hit that wall around 1 or 2. And it's like, okay, well now I'm like at a lull, I need to get a coffee or something. Being able to shift that plan to like, oh, actually that early morning is actually my most productive hours, which I analyzed after I read this book. It's like, oh, I'm an early bird. I shouldn't waste those 3 hours, that 2 hours in the morning working out. I should be working during that time. And then I can go work out, between 1:30 and 2:30 is when I hit the wall. And if I can go get that workout in, then it kind of sets me up to crank for another 3, 4, 5 hours later on in the day. And I think in 2018, 2019, there was a negative connotation around the fact of, hey, wait, where's Bret at? Oh, he's in the gym. Like there was a negative connotation around that versus today. I think that's very commonplace of like, oh, you kind of fit, the whole, instead of trying to fit your life into work, you're fitting work into your life. That's a big piece of it for me. Like the mental health benefit that I get from, working out every day is a huge piece of, I guess, call it my quote unquote productivity. The other piece that's a challenge for me is I consider myself like a bit of I'll call it an analytical creative. Like my job is kind of to, and I started this business unit, or, was fortunate enough to be given the opportunity to start this business unit in 2020. This wasn't something that we had, but again, it's just kind of a first principles. What are the things that really matter that clients need better information on? And that was how this business came about. So I don't think I would thrive in an environment where it's like, hey, you need to, obviously we all have deadlines that we have to manage, but being given the autonomy, and that is something that I love about the brokerage space, right? And very few roles in brokerage is somebody ultimately breathing down your neck unless you're, a direct, customer service in a direct customer service role. But it's a long-winded answer, I guess, of being intentional about how you block your time.
I love your answer. And let me just lay something out for you. So that I think what you just said is so important. And I think anybody running a business today needs to understand what you just said, because you've hit on some things that show how radically businesses change. And I don't think most people 50 and older, including the Jamie Dimons of the world, is quite understand what you just said. I learned how to work and study as a student and then work from a generation above that did it the same way. Books, paper, writing. That generation did it from the generation above. We are now talking about the millennials and the Gen Xers who started where computers were part of their daily life. I'm a Gen Xer. Computers came around in the 70s. A millennial, their whole life there's been computers. The Zs have their whole life there's been cell phones. And we are putting I find 50-year-olds and older, when you talk about office and when is it coming back, they're putting the expectation of what they did when they were in their 20s and 30s. Which you were graded if you turned the light on at 7 a.m. You were graded because you were in your desk or at your cubicle all day. That's how productivity was managed. Post-COVID, it's totally blown up. You cannot work for our company if you are not working in a software, which means I can track you everywhere you go. Now, I try not to abuse any of those things, but you're going to be an accountant. You got to be in Yardi. You're going to be looking at VTS for our leasing stuff. You're going to be in DealPath for our acquisitions. We live by Asana. That's our project management. That is the core of our company. And I think what's happening in this disconnect, beyond the fact that higher interest rates means that when loans term, your loan has gone up 500 bips, and we're just not there yet to understand the life you describe, because that's what's happening now, and that's the future. That flexibility of the time. And the productivity will be measured, but it won't be measured in 1970s ways of measuring or 1980s ways of measuring. And so you got me really excited to hear someone articulate what it means to go out and be a hustler today. And that means that you figure out when you're most productive, you maximize those. When you're least productive, you try to take care of yourself. And the office of the future is going to have to take care of all of that. Otherwise, it's not going to work. People aren't going to go there.
I think the office as an enabler, and basically, and I think I call it like paying the tax of the commute and ultimately justifying that tax in the way that it's adding incremental value to your life, whether that's socially, whether again, physically from like the right gym or, maybe, whatever, quote unquote, free lunches. I think that's a really, really big deal and very well articulated on your side.
Well, let me ask you this, because there's a big pushback right now. And I think it comes from an employer point of view. Like, if I'm going to ask people to come in, I want to make sure they have these creative collisions. I want to make sure they get together and they see each other. But what's happened, the result has been we are being meeting to death. And people are like, oh, they're not going to today. So they'll Zoom in and we'll have 4 of us around a table and we'll have the Zoom come in. And we'll do it. And it feels to me that the employer is saying, well, we're going to try to make it worth their while for coming in by putting a bunch of meetings. Well, if it's not, and that I think is not helping us. When you're talking to clients, when you're talking to people, what do you think? How's this going to even out? Where we don't justify having office space by having 8 meetings back to back. How does it play out when you're sitting there at 34? How do you want the next 10 years of your work life to look like? One, it sounds like you like coming into an office and being around people, so that's going to be a part of it. Two, you don't want to be told that the workday is 8 to 5 because that's not your most productive. And then three, you want to have, it sounds to me like you've got to have outside parts of your life be a part of your work life, ability to work out, ability to take breaks. So how do you see the next 10 years and what you're doing and how you'll live?
Yeah, great question. I mean, a couple key things here. One, I think you have to look at like our evolution as a species, right? From agrarian to industrial to call it computer to whatever this you want to call this next age. Effectively, like there's a reason that the assembly line. My grandpa worked at Caterpillar his entire career. He was late 2 days ever. And both of those days he got hit by drunk drivers on the way to work somehow, in the morning. But my point there is that in that day and time, your productivity or your impact on the organization, it had a lot more to do with when you showed up, right? Because if we were missing one person from the assembly line, we couldn't operate. As technology continues to advance, a smaller and smaller percentage of the human population is creating a greater percentage of the value in the world, at least measured by economic terms. So I think organizations that want to be successful going forward are going to have to, try to build an environment that cultivates and enables that top, whatever it is, top 5, 10, 20, 1%, whatever that number is, to enable those people to be more effective. Because I think we're going from an input-based society, which was how much time are you there, to an output-based society, which is, hey, what is the outcome that you're able to generate within your business? And going back to my earlier questions on the value of asking the right questions and using artificial intelligence effectively. There's a lot of jobs. I remember when I was at Allstate, we had a individual who was good enough at SQL coding that he effectively replaced a department, or I'll call it a miniature department of like 9 people, and effectively took all of their work that they were doing in a given week, and he could do it in about 3.5 hours. Using some, so even Alteryx back in the day, it's still a very prevalent tool, using some tools like that to effectively automate the reporting process. Well, if that guy wants to come to work at 9 and frankly even wants to leave at 2, he should probably be able to do that because of the value that he's creating for the organization. So I think the way that we need to be more intentional about evaluating, hey, what is the objective of this role and how are we really clear in defining that? And then what is the work environment and or the ecosystem that person needs to be in to effectively do that work? And consequently, what types of tasks does that require? And do those tasks require being in person or not? And then also, and what are those? And I do firmly believe in the value of these like collisions. But a week and a half ago, I was at my lake house with guys who one of them interned for me back in the day, but 2 of them are CTOs of, one of them's a Y Combinator. They're in Y Combinator right now. The other one's in Techstars. The other one another guy worked for the NSA full time when he was 17. And so, I had 3 or 4 guys come from around the country. Only one other guy had any background in real estate at all. And the intent of our, 2-day kind of offsite was to say, I've known you for a while. You kind of know what I do. You're intrigued by my space. Let me talk to you about some of the current business problems that I'm solving for clients. But what I want you to bring to the table is, what is the most modern, blank piece of paper? What are the things that you see have advanced the most in the last 18 months in terms of artificial intelligence? Where is that today and where is it going? Because those are really the tools in the tool belt that I want to be aware of to say, how do I, in as modern a fashion as possible, attack the business problems that I'm seeing today with the most efficient tools, right? You got a guy, you can dig 4 times as fast with a shovel, but if the guy next to you's got an excavator, he's going to be able to dig a lot bigger hole a lot faster, right? So that's the world we're in today. And so how you as an organization go about evaluating that, monitoring that, and even the rate of change, right? Look at that, whether it's the average length, the average age of an organization in the S&P 500, the rate of change in the world is continuing to accelerate. And that means the gap between what companies have and what they need across every sector is widening. And that gap is opportunity. And I think having a really strong pulse on the latest capabilities and the right, talent profiles to get you access to those capabilities is going to be increasingly critical to organization survival.
So let me just a real simple question. Describe for me, if you were running Colliers, what you think your ideal day should be. And let's start with, is it in an office? Let's start with, meetings. How many in person? How would you think, in the role that you're in, your perfect day should go on during the week on a work day?
So I'll speak very discreetly to my own role, just because, I think every broker, again, it's all about the responsibilities, right? The roles and responsibilities of the individual. But for me, I try on ideally to not have meetings before 11 a.m. because that's my best thinking period. So the ability to get up, whatever, 5:36, have a cup of coffee, kind of, I try not to look at my phone for the first like 20 minutes, which does sometimes work, sometimes doesn't. And then I like to look at try to look at the news, listen to a podcast. I'm a big podcast guy. Like I almost never watch TV. But that's like, I think you can be a little bit more intentional with what you consume in the podcast arena. But then, and then probably have your client meetings go from sometime like 11 to, whatever it is, 2:33. And then have kind of that last half of the day to basically catch up on whatever kind of came in the hopper in the first half. But I think—
Do you value in-person meetings? Do you value them?
Massively. The part of the reason I spend a lot of time on an airplane is because I think that the trust that you can build in person is, it's so palpable. And I'm sure there's a lot of studies that probably back this up. And if, the world today enables you to hop on a Zoom meeting, but it's that there's probably some term for this, but it's a little bit of that pre-meeting chat and that post-meeting chat and that thing that comes up when you're in person that really wasn't intended. That wasn't the point of the meeting. That is a lot of times where the opportunity is. Because, maybe said differently, the meeting is designed to solve a problem somebody knows they have. That pre and post-meeting, I'll call it like gossip or narrative or chit-chat, that may be the thing that unlocks the next opportunity for it's like, wow, I didn't realize, going back to my world of business problem data, application of technology and analytics, I didn't realize that other companies were having this business problem. I didn't know that, there's a data set available to evaluate something like that. Or, I didn't realize this new technology could do that. And I would expect each of those insights to come from a different party, right? And really kind of two. It's like one, the business problem piece is probably going to come from a customer, maybe a broker. And then the data and the tech, that's probably going to be something that comes from, I'll call it the team that I work with, across the country. So I massively value the
So what you've described to me is also why the old way of looking at office doesn't work, because you're in the client service business. You have a national and international business, which means to have that FaceTime means getting on airplanes. And so what's that do for the team you're on? Do you guys need to meet in person once a week? Every 2 weeks is okay? Because a lot of it, you're traveling and you're probably with some of the team. How do you look at the headquarters office meeting with your team? How often does that have to happen?
Yeah. So I try to see, like in a perfect world, I would love to see the individuals on my team, both up and down the ladder, once a quarter, just to touch base, and again, and whether that's, and as far as like a strategy session, whether you need to do that once a quarter, probably once every 6 months or something in a perfect world, just to say, hey, here's where we're trying, here's where we think we're going. Here's the progress we've made in getting there. And by the way, that destination probably looks a lot different today in the current environment with things changing as quickly as they were than it did 6 months ago. And again, depending on what role you're in and how defined, because there's certain roles within brokerage, right, where it's a pretty clear, you're a producer, so your job is to get meetings, or, hey, you're a transaction manager. So, hey, here's, based on the complexity and whatever, effectively the complexity of the project, here's how many transactions I expect you to be able to manage, and here's what success looks like. There's certain roles where it's much more, we'll call it like homogenous in terms of how you evaluate what is someone who's effective in that role. And then there's other roles that are more creative, if you want to call it that, and it's a little bit tougher. But I think, again, the future looks a lot different than the past. So the evolving solutions are going to look a lot different than what exists today. So how do you try to balance being effective today with also creating for tomorrow?
Well, we've been talking for almost an hour, but there's two things I want to hit on with you, because when we had our and we had some exchange, you hit on something that I think is really important. You're 34 years old. You're obviously driven. You're a go-getter. You want to get things done. But I find I have a brother who's 39, who's got a significant other who's 33. They spend a lot of focus on the difference between, yes, they want to make a lot of money, but they want to have life experience, whether it's they haven't started a family, but they're people have started a family, I mean, I've never heard the term when I was younger, co-parenting, and therefore the responsibilities mean I can't work because my doing something for my partner or spouse. But how do you look? You're 34 years old. You got the world ahead of you. How do you look at that relationship between what it takes to make a lot of money and what you'd want to also do with your time to have a fulfilling life?
Man, that's said this at the last presentation I gave. I've got that Peter Drucker quote: "The most dangerous thing in business is finding the right answer to the wrong question." I think you could remove the word business and insert life. And so the most dangerous thing in life is finding the right answer to the wrong question. I think a lot of people, I mean, if you look at, there's a few studies out there of like 95-year-olds, and they ask like, hey, what are your biggest regrets? And I think the top three are, let me see if I can get these, but it's like, I wish I wouldn't have worked so much. I wish I would have spent more time on things that'll be around when I'm gone. And I think it's, I wish I would have invested more in relationships. And if you look at like, what are the indicators of happiness? It's basically the volume and the depth of your relationships. So I think being intentional about your ability to cultivate those, whether those are inside or outside of the office, is something I spend a fair amount of time thinking about. This is a little bit of a cop out, but like Ray Dalio asked the question, if you could only make an impact on the world or be happy, which of those would you pick? It's one of my favorite questions. And I think my answer might have shifted over time. From that, hey, I want to have a big impact on the world, to ultimately I want to be happy. And I do think that there's some lens on this whole, how do you fit life into work, and not just, because again, there's another book and I can't think of the name. I'll get it to you for the notes, but it's probably the most impactful book that I've read in the last 2 years. And it talks about basically the whole point of the book is I want to say it's like the essential elements of time, but that's not it. But and you can't even find like a digital version. It was written like 2007. But the premise of it was, how do you, like, 2 50-year-olds can have lived the same, they have birthdays on the same day, and they've lived different lengths of life to that point, because time is actually measured in memories, and memories are measured in change. Like, we've all had those periods of life, whether it was school or, you're studying for a certain designation or something, where you're just kind of heads, or it's a big deal, and you're just heads down grinding every day, right? And you wake up one day and it was like, man, it was January 1st yesterday, and today it's, it's the first day of June, and that time just evaporated. So how do you be intentional about introducing change and trying to build those memories and those memory dividends along the way? I mean, I think that's one of the great paradoxes of life, is how do you enjoy the journey while also being very intentional about the, the goals that you're pursuing. And I transparently, I haven't figured that out yet. But it's something.
Nor should you have. I don't think anybody ever figures out, but I'll leave you with a couple that maybe resonate with you. Steve Jobs said, and it was interviewed, and it's always stuck with me. And he said, this whole world, your whole life of what you did was designed by people who are no smarter than you. And yet we all are so willing just to accept that this is the way it is. And I'll give you one example. Any idea why we have election day on a Tuesday in November? It's because when they started the country, they wanted to put every polling place within a 2-day ride to get to, and they didn't want, and nobody would give up Sunday for church. So they made it on Tuesday, and you had all day to vote. And that's still 250 years later why we don't have it on a Sunday. We don't have it on a national holiday. So I love what you've been saying. You've got me thinking, and I've combined that with the Steve Jobs quote is, it wasn't like some genius came down and said we have to work 60 hours a week in an office, or, and that's it. We just live with all these things we inherited. And so I love what you're doing. It inspires me. I'll tell you, for our company, which was the second largest landlord in downtown LA, and now we're a national real estate company, we're making major changes on how we work and what we expect of people. And a lot of it is believing people have personal responsibility. A lot of it is making sure that people have creative collisions that are worthwhile, and recognizing that the efficiency of work has increased so much that if you try to hold on to something that happened 5 years ago and how somebody worked, they don't apply anymore. So this has been such a great conversation for me. I want to leave it with one thing for you. As you are talking to people out there about the services that you bring, what do you think Colliers offers as something unique for you to pitch business, and how do you play a role in that? I mean, I think not many 34-year-olds get that opportunity with the CEO to be able to say that, and you've come a long way to get it. So why is Colliers the best platform, and why has it allowed you to excel?
So I don't know. It's the only major brokerage that I've ever worked at. So I don't know what it's like in the other environments. But it's, we talk about our enterprising or entrepreneurial culture. And I think my career here to this point has been a testament of that. Right. I started on a brokerage team kind of with a unique approach, and then have transferred to kind of running a national platform that, we started out kind of solving this labor issue because we thought it was the most important thing that people didn't have as good of information on. And now that's pivoted into a number of different areas. And they effectively let us kind of skate to where the puck is going versus keeping us inside of a given vertical. And, I'm careful in how I say this, but it's like we're a little bit business problem agnostic. It's really like, how do we get the best information for our clients and make sure that we're not finding the right answer to the wrong question? And I'm not saying that, again, I don't know what that looks like inside of all our competitors really discreetly, but I think it's by having a little bit, I'll call it flatter or more like latitude to be able to roam, if you will, we're able to kind of, I guess, better integrate, or my thesis would be that we're able to better integrate some of these best practices, at least from an analytical perspective, across segments to say, whether you're looking for a data center or your next retail location or your next, you're trying to figure out how to dispose of this office. We really start with kind of a first principles approach and say, how do we make sure that we really understand, again, those symptoms, that business problem that you're trying to solve, get you the best in class data and pair that with best in class technology and analytics to get you an outcome that we really think is differentiated. There's a lot of opportunity. Frankly, the commercial real estate world, there's this concept of like Dutch disease where effectively, if you look back historically, the countries that were the most resource rich ultimately fell behind. At one point, 80% of the GDP in the United States came out of Virginia and Maryland. Right. So you think like, the South, like they should have dominated, but, the North was heavier from an innovation perspective because they didn't have some of that natural resource advantage. And that's the way I think about this industry a lot. There's a ton of people who made a lot of money, and there's still a ton of money to be made. And all of those skill sets that were important then are going to be important in the future. But there's certainly, because of the way the external environment is shifting, there's a really big opportunity, I think, for, people that are a lot younger and a lot smarter than me with a very different skill set to come into the industry and have a big impact. But the challenge is can you actually get exposure to the right business problems to be able to apply those skills, those technologies, those tools, ask those questions? And that is something that Colliers has enabled for me to this point.
That's terrific.
But
hey, Brett, this has been
I have one question for you because I thought it was a really good. How do you think about this? Work-life balance and paying again that tax of time. What have you done that's like and maybe you've answered this on other podcasts, but how do you think about
I appreciate the question. I appreciate the question. I'm happy to answer it because it's been hitting me a lot lately. I had a father who's well known and kind of a leader in the business, both locally and nationally. And he taught me a way to work that doesn't apply at all anymore. And that's okay because, there's a reason why somebody wrote the book, Who Moved My Cheese, because things evolve. Yeah. I have found that my key to happiness is control of my schedule and my life. I spent my life is not the way it's control of the things that I can control. And the thing that I can control is my schedule. I thought, having worked for John Cushman for all these years, a lot of my life, you say yes to everything and you go everywhere and you burn yourself out and you just go, go, go. That's what hard work meant. I now realize that hard work means saying no to a lot of things, having enough time to be very strategic in how you think, recognizing your age in all of this. And that at some, if I was advising my younger self, no, you got to use that hustle and go to places that the 50-year-olds won't, because that'll get you seen. But at the end of the day, I really believe the key to being happy and the key to this is you've got to have time for meditation and call it prayer, call it soul reflection. You've got to have that. And you have to put that in. You have to take care of your health. And the idea, and I got to tell you, I grew up with this, that you go out and have a big state dinner, drink 3 bottles of wine, but I'm tough. I'm getting up at 5 a.m. and I'm going to work. That's what I grew up with, is horrible. And that's what leads to dementia and all these other. So taking care of your health has to be a priority. And I think, so having your alone time, taking care of your health, both with what you eat and how you sleep and working out. And I think the third thing that people forget, you never reach a point in your life where you've learned it all. You have to have the mentality that every day I'm going to learn something I didn't know. I'm not going to be arrogant about it. I'm going to learn. I've learned things from you and we're 20 years apart. what you've taught me today, and the things I wrote down about it. And you got to drop any arrogance. I think so many people as they get older think, well, I got to where I was supposed to be. So now people have to serve me and people have to do what I say. I think what's great about technology in your generation is you don't have time for men and women who think that way. You're just going to blow by them. And so when I talk to my children, I say, I'm pretty spiritual and religious. I meditate at least 30 minutes, but usually twice a day. That's part, my wife knows that's part of it. My kids know it. I work out every day and I always learn. And I think I always try to learn. And I guess I'll put a fourth thing. You can't control everything. So most of the time, you just have to be okay putting in good days, hard days work, following things and letting the chips fall where they may. Because the stress and the anxiety comes from me trying to tell you to do something and force you to do something. I can't control that. I can only lay out what I can do. So hopefully that's helpful.
I'm very happy I asked the question because that is, it's a phenomenal response. And a lot to think about there.
And remember, you try to please everybody, you please no one. I used to laugh at that comment, but it's the most unbelievable thing I've ever. Saying no to somebody is the best gift you can give somebody.
I feel that.
Yeah.
That's a big opportunity area. I'll put it that way.
All right. Well, I loved having you on. Thanks for being on The Real Market.
Chris. Yeah. Thanks for your time.